When I say mummies, which country comes to mind? Egypt, right? But guess what? The world's oldest mummies have been found in Southeast Asia from burial sites in China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Beneath one of the deadliest deserts on Earth, in the driest corner of China, the sand has been hiding bodies that were never supposed to be there. Faces 4,000 years old, still intact. Tall figures with high noses, deep-set eyes, and hair the color of straw and rust, resting in a place where no one like them should have existed. For a century, scientists called them strangers who wandered in from somewhere far away. Then they read the code hidden inside the bodies. They were not Chinese. They were not Mongols. They were not Turkic. And it shattered every rule about who came first. What the sand was keeping is stranger than anyone imagined. The devouring sand. So let me tell you about this desert because it is the whole reason any of this survived. It is called the Taklamakan, and the name is basically a warning. In the local tongue, it means roughly the place you enter but never leave. It sits inside the Darim Basin in western China, a huge bowl of sand and salt walled off by mountains on every side, one of the driest, cruelest landscapes on the planet. Near its center sits the dried-out bed of a dead lake called Lop Nur, a place that later became a site for Chinese nuclear testing. Now, nothing about a place like that should preserve anything. Everything about it says eraser. The climate in the Taklamakan Desert is arid, so extremely dry. And yet this basin has kept its dead better than almost anywhere on Earth, better in some ways than the tombs of Egypt. It is not embalming. It is chemistry. The air is savagely dry, the soil is loaded with salt, and between them they pulled the water straight out of the bodies laid in that ground until the flesh simply dried in place. The desert did it by accident, drawing the moisture out so completely that eyelashes survived, skin lines survived, and the fine hair on a forearm survived thousands of years after the heart under it stopped. That is the part to hold on to. Whatever these people were, the sand kept them whole. So when they came back into the light, they came carrying their own answer, waiting for someone to learn how to read it. The first face. Go back to that woman near Lulan. The year is 1980, and Chinese archaeologists are out there filming a documentary about the ancient Silk Road when they find her buried barely a meter down, wrapped in wool and felt. You know her now as the Beauty of Lulan, and the dating puts her at roughly 1,800 years before the Common Era. There were a lot of very specific characteristics you don't find in any other place. She had been lying in that sand for close to 4,000 years, and her face was still there, not a skull, a face. But she was not even the strangest part. The richer find was farther out, deeper into the desert at a site called Xiaohe, the small river cemetery number 5, sometimes called Ordex Necropolis after the hunter who first led outsiders to it. When systematic excavation opened it up in the early 2000s, it revealed one of the strangest burial grounds ever recorded. The bodies had been laid inside hollowed wooden coffins shaped like boats, sealed over with hide. Above them stood a whole forest of tall wooden markers carved into shapes archaeologists still cannot fully explain. One of the dead became known as the Beauty of Xiaohe. She still had her eyelashes. She still had her hair. She wore a white hat of felted wool, a woolen cloak, boots lined with fur, and tucked in close against her body were little pouches of a plant called ephedra, placed there on purpose by hands you and I will never see. And that is where the trouble starts, because when you really look at these people, none of it adds up. The wrong faces. What made that cemetery extraordinary was not one spectacular body. It was the accumulation. Hundreds of individuals preserved right down to the strands of their hair, dressed in woven cloth, buried with care across generations in a place that should have been impossible to live in at all. Every one of them handed the excavators the same quiet problem. They did not look like the desert around them. They did not look like the people who live there today, or the people history says arrived later. The problem was in their faces. When these bodies came out, they did not have the features anyone expects in the heart of Asia. Many were tall, their eye sockets deep set, their noses high and narrow, and their hair ranged from pale flaxen to deep rust red, every strand kept by the salted ground. To the first researchers standing over them, these looked like people who belonged thousands of kilometers to the west. And yet there they were in the driest corner of western China. The clothes only made it worse. These were not people scraping together rough hides to survive. They wore woven wool, some of it patterned with twill and checks that reminded people of textiles made far away in Central Europe. There were felt hats, carefully shaped, and one man was reportedly buried with a whole collection of them. Material culture, with a sense of style and a landscape that offers no clue where the knowledge to make it came from. So you stand over a body that should not be here, everything about it wrong for the map in your head, and you ask the obvious question. The discoveries became even more puzzling as archaeologists uncovered hundreds of remarkably preserved bodies buried across generations in a landscape that seemed impossible to inhabit. Their facial features did not resemble the people historically associated with the region. Many of the mummies were tall, with deep-set eyes, narrow high noses, and hair ranging from pale blonde to reddish-brown, all preserved by the desert's salty, dry environment. Their clothing added another layer to the mystery. Instead of crude animal hides, they wore finely woven wool garments, patterned textiles, felt hats, fur-lined boots, and carried carefully crafted personal belongings. Archaeologists also found sprigs and pouches of ephedra placed beside many of the bodies, suggesting a repeated cultural or ritual practice, although its exact purpose remains unknown. These burials dated to more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road connected the region to distant civilizations, long before Han Chinese expansion or the arrival of later populations such as the Uyghurs. Scholars like Victor Mayer spent decades trying to answer the same question. How did people with such unusual physical characteristics come to exist in one of the most isolated deserts on Earth? For years, nearly every theory assumed they had migrated from somewhere else, with researchers proposing origins in the Western Eurasian steppes, Central Asian oasis cultures, or ancient mountain migration routes. Yet despite the different explanations, they all relied on one shared assumption, that these mysterious people had come from outside the Darim Basin. The road that wasn't. The road was not there. I want you to sit with that for a second. There was no detectable Western steppe ancestry in these people. No Affinicivo signal. None of the genetic fingerprints of migration from the west or the north would have left behind. Decades of arguing over which journey these people made, and the genomes came back with a verdict that fit none of them. The Darim founders had not come from anywhere else. They were a genetically isolated local population descended from people who had already been living in and around this region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before the first grave was ever dug. And the makeup of them was striking. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced back to a lineage geneticist called the ancient North Eurasians, and the rest, about 28%, came from an ancient Northeast Asian source. Read that back because it is the whole reversal in one line. Every theory had been a different answer to the same question. Which faraway homeland sent these people? And the genomes replied that none of them did. Here is the part that gets under your skin. All around them in that same Bronze Age, the neighboring populations were mixing freely, trading genes across the region in every direction the land allowed. The Darim people were not. They sat right in the middle of all that movement and stayed sealed, marrying among themselves, absorbing no one. A genetic island in a landscape full of traffic. Do you see what that does to the mystery? It flips it completely. For a century, the question was how these strangers got here. Which route carried them across half a continent to die in the sand? And the genomes just erased the question because there was never any arrival. These were not migrants who came from far away and looked out of place. They were a people who had always been here, isolated and unmoving while the entire world turned over around them, which only makes the real problem worse because if they never came from anywhere, then those faces still have to be explained. So, who on earth were they? The ghost lineage. If they were local, the question stops being where they traveled from and becomes who they descended from. And that trail runs straight back to a people who had very nearly vanished off the face of the earth. Geneticists call them the ancient North Eurasians. They were Ice Age hunter-gatherers of the Siberian interior, a people who spread across the frozen heart of the continent and then, as the glaciers pulled back, faded out of the record almost everywhere they had ever been. For the longest time, nobody even knew they existed. They were a gap, a shape that other populations seemed to require. A ghost you could only see by its outline, never directly. Then a body gave the ghost a face. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia, there is a site called Malta. Buried there was a child, a boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago at the peak of the last ice age when ice smothered most of the northern world. His remains had actually been dug up decades earlier back in the 1920s. But it was a team led by Esk Willerslev in Copenhagen that finally sequenced his genome and published it. That boy, known to science as MA1, turned out to belong to the exact population researchers had suspected but never confirmed. He was the first clear face of the ancient North Eurasians, a ghost made real. And here is why the word ghost fits so well. They left almost no whole descendants, and yet their DNA is smeared all across the modern world. A big share of Native American ancestry traces back to them, by some estimates somewhere between 14 and 38%. Up to a fifth of the ancestry of many Europeans runs to the same source. Think about what that means. This vanished ice age, people threaded their genes into populations on opposite sides of the planet. People who never met and never mixed. And then the source itself disappeared. It survives now mostly as fragments hidden inside everyone else. A signal buried in strangers who never knew they were carrying it. Now, hold that thought against the mummies because that ghost lineage, the one that survives almost nowhere on Earth as a whole, is exactly what was lying in the sand of that Chinese desert. These were not distant cousins of the ancient North Eurasians. They were among the best preserved representatives of that lost people found anywhere on the planet, held intact by the salt long after the lineage itself had faded out almost everywhere else. So, the out-of-place faces were never out of place at all. They were simply old, older than any migration theory ever reached for. And it turns out these people were carrying a second secret, one that has nothing to do with their blood at all. Sealed and open. Because here is the paradox the same study uncovered, and it might be the strangest part of the whole thing. These people were sealed shut by blood and thrown wide open by culture at the very same time. Their own teeth gave it away. Traces of milk proteins and the hardened plaque on their teeth showed they were dairy herders from the very beginning. And their diet braided the whole of Eurasia together. Wheat and dairy that came from West Asia, millet that came from the East, ephedra drawn from Central Asia. They borrowed farming, herding, and medicine from every direction the compass offered, and they married none of the people who brought it to them. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it is genuinely hard to hold in your head. A people open enough to import the diet of an entire continent, and closed enough that not one of the people who carried those goods to them ever married in. Trade flowed freely. Genes did not move at all. They took the entire world's technology and kept their own bloodline untouched. A people who looked like no one nearby descended from a population that had ceased to exist thousands of years before they were laid in those boat-shaped coffins. Living alone in the sand, taking gifts from everyone, letting no one in. It is one of the purest examples of that split anywhere in the ancient record. And step back because the scale of what those genomes rewrote is bigger than it first looks. This was never really a story about 13 bodies in a cemetery. It was a correction to how the deep interior of Asia got peopled in the first place. What the DNA showed was an ancient isolated ice age lineage surviving in place across thousands of years, holding its ground in one of the harshest basins on Earth. While every population around it turned over again and again, these people were not some footnote to someone else's migration. They were the last of a world that had otherwise ended. And that leaves a lesson sitting right in the middle of the table, the one that keeps researchers up at night. Genes and culture do not have to travel together. We tend to assume that when ideas move, people move with them. That a new crop or a new tool always means new blood arriving behind it. The Darim founders quietly proved that wrong. A people can pull farming from one direction, herding from another, medicine from a third, and weave an entire continent into their daily life without letting a single outsider into their blood. Isolation and cosmopolitanism sound like opposites. And yet here they describe the same people at the same moment. So if the DNA answered where they came from this cleanly, why is so much about them still unsolved? What the sand keeps. Because the answer did not close every door, and I would be lying to you if I pretended it did. Start with language. Whether these people actually spoke an early form of Tocharian, that extinct Indo-European tongue later found in the basin, cannot be pulled out of their DNA. Full stop. The scholar Elizabeth Wayland Barber has warned against just assuming it, pointing to a gap of roughly 1,000 years between the mummies and the first written traces of Tocharian. Plenty of time for a language to move in without the people changing at all. Others, like the linguist Ronald Kim, argue the timing could still work. The honest truth is the evidence sits between them, and it is not my place or yours to force it one way. Then there is the scope. As powerful as that study was, it sampled basically one horizon at one site. As the geneticist Vaghesh Narasimhan pointed out, wider sampling across more of the basin could complicate the whole picture, turning up ties the first 13 genomes simply could not show, and access itself is still a wall. The political sensitivity of the region and the restrictions on foreign research mean the record here is far from fully read. A lot of what these bodies could still tell us is locked behind the sand and behind circumstance. So here is the honest position, and no further than the evidence goes. The DNA nailed down where the Darien people came from. It did not tell you their whole story. How an Ice Age relic population ended up thriving alone in the Taklamakan, held together for thousands of years while refusing every neighbor, and what finally became of them as the centuries closed over that cemetery is still only half answered. The genomes gave you the beginning with a certainty nothing before had come close to. The middle and the end are still being pieced together out of fragments. The last of them. So here is what you can actually say. A century of assumptions got overturned by a single reading of their genetic code. And the truth it exposed was stranger than any journey anyone had ever dreamed up for them. They were not travelers who arrived. They were survivors who stayed long after the world that made them was gone. So go back one last time to the desert and to the bodies it kept. The beauty of Lulon, the beauty of Xiaohe. Faces still intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years. Still wearing their felt hats. Still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For 100 years, we treated them as strangers who wandered in from somewhere far away, a migration puzzle waiting to be traced across a map. And their own DNA turned around and told us something so much stranger. They were the last of a people who were already ancient. A ghost lineage out of the Ice Age that survives now mostly as scattered fragments of code, carried quietly inside billions of us, and almost nowhere on Earth as a whole. And the desert still holds what it has not handed over yet. Sealed graves, restricted labs, questions the sand has kept for 30 centuries, layer beneath layer, still being read one body at a time. So, if this is the kind of story you come here for, the kind where the ground itself rewrites everything we thought we knew, then subscribe and stick around because there are more of these waiting. And before you go, I really want to know what you think. So, drop it in the comments. If their DNA had never been read, do you think we would still be calling them strangers today? Tell me.